Hello, BookTube. I'm here to do a tag. It's an original tag that Steve Donoghue created. It's called the Penguin Classics book tag. There are 6 questions, so I'll jump right into it. Question number 1. Penguin Classics are the best reprint volumes in the whole world. How many do you currently own? That's a little difficult, and I'll explain why. The black ones I have approximately 115. I think there's a few that are hiding. They're a bit shy. I've got what do they call those? The prestige ones that are in the larger editions. So I have about 5 of those, I think. But I also have a whole raft of 50 plus older penguins that a lot of the authors have now migrated towards the black classics. Of all the titles, I'm not sure, but they're authors such as D.H. Lawrence, Henry James, Joseph Conrad. Those are the ones that I know I have large numbers of. And then, the Conrad and James, I think, were green, and the D.H. Lawrence were orange ones, and I have a bunch of other old orange penguins that are now as well. So I probably have upwards between 50 and 75 of those. So take your pick. 115 or 180 potentially. And I have some other older, a couple brown ones that were the old color of the classics. So it's indeterminate. It would take me a while to find out exactly, but if you just want to go by the black ones that I have currently, 115-ish. Number 2. Penguins evolved roughly 70 million years ago. What's your history with the Penguin Classics? That goes back to late 70s. I remember in class doing the Odyssey by Homer. All the students, all of us were given copies, and I think the majority of copies that were given out were Signet Classics. If they didn't do, then it was something that was similar. If they didn't do a Homer's Odyssey. But they didn't have enough for every student, so they had to give out some penguins. And I got one of the penguins, and from what I remember, it must have been a prose translation. I'm quite sure, because I'm sure I later bought myself the same edition sometime in the 80s. But yeah, that was my first knowledge of sort of the black penguins, I think. Probably penguins in general. No, I think I knew there was penguins before that, yeah, but maybe not the classics. I think that was my first introduction to classics. And then I really loved the Odyssey, and I became interested in classic literature, Greek and Roman literature. So the library didn't have much at all, and then I later moved to Toronto, where there were bookshops and better libraries. But I began collecting classics, the smaller mass market penguins classics, and I remember triumphantly coming home with Livy's Hannibal War, the War with Hannibal, and Thucydides, and a few others. That was my first sort of haul of them, and I devoured them. And I began, every time I found some that I could afford, I bought and read. I devoured them. I think by the time I was done in the 80s, I think I had every Greek and Roman classic they had, and a smattering of other things like the Nile Saga and a few other things like that, Icelandic stuff, and Norse and other sort of Anglo-Saxon, a little bit of smattering, but for some reason, I just rarely ever saw those. That was the thing. But anyway, number 3, the Penguin Classics logo is, of course, a penguin, a world's most famous flightless bird. What is a classic that you didn't take flight with you? Well, there were a few. All of Jane Austen. Read them all. Didn't like them. All the Brontes. Didn't like them. And I read them all. I gave them all a chance. I just did not like them at all. It sort of soured me in some ways for 19th century English writing for a long time. And then I moved towards French, 19th century French. But then again, I'm just glad I didn't run into the first one, was Stendhal's Red and the Black, which I thought was just horrid. I'm glad that came after a lot of Balzac, Zola, you name it. A lot of stuff. Hugo, Dumas, Guy de Maupassant, a lot. I'm just glad it came after all that, because otherwise it might have soured my French 19th century literature. Number 4, the emperor penguin is the most recognizable species, but the Adelie is everybody's favorite. What is your favorite penguin classic? That's difficult. But just because Steve doesn't like Les Miserables, I'm going to say Les Miserables. It is one of my favorites, so it's difficult. Other than that, I would say a very close second would be Herodotus. But I will say Les Miserables. Let's see here. Number 5, Penguin Classics began in 1946 with EV Rieu's translation of the Odyssey. That must have been the translation that I had, because I don't think it changed at that time. What's your favorite book from 1946 or the 40s in general? I sort of looked up. I couldn't find one for 1946 for some reason. I didn't search very far, but I had to verify some. 1940, C.P. Snow, Charles Percy Snow, started his Strangers and Brothers series, which wasn't called that at the time, obviously, but it was George Passat, 1940, and then he did 2 more during the 40s, Light and Dark and Time of Hope. Light and Dark was 1947 and 1949, Time of Hope. He wrote them out of sequence, like chronological sequence. P.G. Wodehouse continued to write during the 40s, and 2 that stand out are 2 Jeeves. And these are ones, too, that I can reread over and over, so therefore they get a notch higher for favorites. Joy in the Morning, and 1947, and The Mating Season, 1949 for P.G. Wodehouse, their Jeeves and Wooster novels. 1945, Brideshead Revisited, about Yves Lenoir. And we'll end out the decade with George R. Stewart's Earth Abides. And that was 1949. I had to check to make sure, because I thought it was 40s, but I thought it might have slipped into the 50s. Now, this is sort of an appropriate, or potentially appropriate book for 2020. It's an apocalyptic novel. The main character, Isherwood, I can't remember if that's his first name or last name. He's in the mountains. He comes out of isolation after a disease is plaguing the earth. And there's not many people left alive. I'll leave it there. Now, during the 40s, there were a lot of science fiction writers, and this was sort of a heyday. So I'll just sort of, I won't specific because I didn't look up. I just sort of jotted down a bunch of names. Oh, well, there is one that I'm sure is 40s. It's L. Sprague de Camp. Is Lest Darkness Fall. It's a science fiction historical Rome novel, I guess you would say. Olaf Stapleton was writing, Isaac Asimov, Fritz Leiber. Can't even read my writing here. I got Martin someone, but I can't think of who that is. Ward Moore. Oh yeah, there was several of the Lensman series, I believe, were written during the 40s. E. Doc Smith. They're fun series. And Clifford Simak was writing. City was published in 1952, but it's a collection of short stories, and a lot of those were written during the 40s. Other writers, they're writing like Lewis Paget. Trying to remember Chessman, something to do with Chessman that I really enjoyed. Arthur C. Clarke was writing, Hal Clement, Jack Williamson, Alfred Bester. The list can go on, but those are sort of some of them here. Number 5. Penguin Classics began in 1946 with... Oh, no, that's what I just did. Number 6. Penguin Classic tries to enshrine the classics of literature. Name some books that you would like to see enshrined. Now, as Steve said, this sort of, a fantasy world in a sense of getting what you would really want. Now, I thought about this, and then I saw Matthew's take on it, and he mentioned a bunch of 19th century French authors, like the Complete Comedy Humaine by Balzac. That would be fantastic to have something like that. New translations with like sumptuous notes and sumptuous introductions. Oh, I would love that. That would be just beautiful. And he says he's starting to read, or he has read, Daudet's Letters from a Windmill. Oh, that's just beautiful. I've been looking for a copy of that myself. But yeah, other of his, I would just add Zola. But anyway, and then I decided, okay, well, I'll put those aside. He's done that. Now I've taken a different tact here. Now, they have done, which I do have to get copies of these. They've done the Book of the Dead, and Wal Spudge's translation. I saw that on Steve Donoghue, so our video, and I love that. I love that translation by Budge and his other translations. And it has, I think, an introduction by Romer, so yeah, that's a must-get. And then there's another collection of Egyptian literature, but that's not enough. Let's pretend, in my world, they will have a huge, massive library of ancient literature, ancient languages translated, by experts. And by experts, and massive historical contextual apparatus that goes along with it all. Now, this will take a while. We've got a lot more of Egyptian texts, because we started with that. Do the Amarna letters, which are they're Akkadian. They're written in cuneiform, but they're from the Amarna, where Akhenaten, the heretic king, built his city. and they're basically letters back to the Near East. There's some Canaanite stuff. There's Babylonian, Assyrian. They're just sort of kingly letters on various subjects, and they would be cool to have, or a representative of them anyway, with some historical context. A lot more hieratic Egyptian writing from, say, Deir al-Medina. It's just Deir al-Medina was it was sort of the workman's village that dug and painted the walls and did everything like this for the Valley of the Kings. And they wrote on it's called ostraca, but they're basically flakes of limestone that was broken off to build the tombs, like as they're excavating the tombs. So they're nice. Sometimes they're nice big pieces of flat white limestone, and they used a cursive script. It's called hieratic, and there's paintings, there's pornography, there's letters, or there's little notes to say, "Oh, Billy Bob." Well, I'm making a name. Billy Bob next door can't come to work because he was on the lash last night and he's a bit drunk. Or so-and-so can't come to work because he was beaten up. Or so-and-so needs some more food for her pet monkey who, it's all sorts. It's all across the board. There's there's stories, there's poetry, there's all sorts of stuff. It would be nice to have many volumes for the Armana stuff. The Armana and the Deir al-Medina, and there's lots others as well to do. Anyway, I better move on because I have a big list here. Hittite language, the literature, because there's a lot of mythology and stories and administration stuff there. Ugaritic texts. There's like the Baal cycle of poems, a lot more mythology. The Morai texts, where there's thousands and thousands of letters, again in Akkadian cuneiform. I mentioned Deir al-Medina, Avesta. It's like the Zoroastrian literature. Just do a whole bunch of Sanskrit, and not just the stuff that's the popular ones. Aramaic. Do a whole bunch of Talmud and Zohar, Jewish texts, Syriac texts, other Jewish texts from Syriac language. Mesoamerican texts, Mayan and Aztec codexes, to have huge bunch of that. Oh, I put Sanskrit down here again. Chinese literature, just do huge amounts of ancient Chinese literature in a series, and there's a bunch of other Asian languages. There's Arabic texts. There's stuff that's been sitting and hidden in Timbuktu that is, it's perishing now. It's a struggle and it's a race to preserve the material. There's Japanese texts. There's more. There's the Gnostic. I don't know if they might have done a Gnostic text, but there's all sorts of other stuff. There's early these weird and wonderful Christian cults. Areas that were started in various parts, isolated, like the Desert Fathers, and do a whole bunch more of the Apostolic Fathers. I would love to see a huge, wide breadth of ancient languages of all sorts. Do African myths, do Native North American myths, all throughout Southern America. Go into Siberia. Like all these places do all this ancient stuff that is sort of forgotten. Bring it and popularize it. Get people to be interested, because a lot of this stuff, some of it I don't know very well. A lot of it I don't know very well. But the Near Eastern stuff I know a lot better. And it's just wonderful stuff. It's interesting stuff. If you pick and choose the correct ones, people will be fascinated and they will be surprised at the material that's there. I can guarantee it. Especially the Zoroastrian material, the letters from Amarna, other Akkadian stuff, like Steve mentioned, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yeah, that's how I want to get that, because that sounds fascinating. But there are other full texts of stuff, and put it all into context, and people will be amazed at what there is. That would be my perfect world, to have something like that, because this material, a lot of the material is published, or some of it's published, but they're in very, very academic tomes. The Akkadian, like there's a whole series of Akkadian cuneiform texts. I used to have a whole bunch of them, and they are very dry, because they'll just show every little bits and pieces, and it's daunting for anybody to look at. I used to have a lot of the like the Middle Kingdom hieratic material. I think it was Middle Kingdom. Memory's fading. But yeah, just a lot of other Egyptian, ancient Egyptian writings. But again, like this stuff needs to be curated into nice volumes with apparatus, not so much critical apparatus, but historical, contextual apparatus. Like there's a wonderful papyrus, Egyptian papyrus, that's on surgery. Like something like that would be just, I think people would be amazed. Like again, some of this may not be read for pure pleasure, but if they're doing things like the Doomsday Book and the Magna Carta, those aren't read definitely for pleasure. But they're read because they're important documents, and if it's housed correctly, if it's wrapped in this historical contextual material, it'll again bring it more to the masses. People will get to know this stuff, and see what's happening in universities is these languages. There are texts out there that there's only like one or two people left in the world that can read this bloody stuff, and it's just it's deteriorating. There's so much of it in archives throughout the Middle East and the world, that they need to be saved. Yes, they're digitizing it as much as they can, and a lot of this material is up on the internet, but it takes a lot to find it, and sometimes it's just digitized material. There's no contextual historical background to this. How can you read it? And there's only a few people maybe in the world that can read this. And if they had a huge library of this in the Penguin Classics, like I have a separate, they could just split this whole stuff up. They could have the ancient languages, they could have the French literature, and not just 19th century. They could go right back to older literature, and they just do this. But the ancient stuff to me would be just glorious to have, bookcase after bookcase of this material that you could just pull down and just be amazed at what was written thousands of years ago. And I can guarantee it will knock the socks off of most people. I don't know that much about the Mesoamerican, like the Aztec codexes or the Mayan codexes, but the stuff I've looked at, and it's amazing. It's amazing, as well as everything. Anyway, I think I'll end it there. But yeah, that would be my way of expanding the Penguin Classics, doing a representative collections of ancient languages to keep it alive.